first clip here is just going to be Walt Thornhill describing the common sense way for stars to be born. Check it out.
Herschel reveals a ribbon of future stars. This was reported on March the 30th this year. So this is a very recent picture. Stars and planets are formed by powerful electromagnetic forces like pearls on a cosmic string. This is a quote from an earlier report. Gravity can be ignored. Plasma cosmology. There is no gravitational accretion. There's no way you can form a string like that using gravity. Gravity is a central force and the material tends to come into a centre. It doesn't form a string. But this recent report says, and this is important, stars are shot out of the filaments by a slingshot mechanism. And there's a diagram here which shows the filaments moving around like those in the plasma ball, you know, where they snake about. The stars having been formed in this filament are left behind as the filament moves on and these stars are shot out. And it's interesting because Tony Peratt described to us once the effect seen in high-energy discharge experiments as these plasmoids scattered like buckshot. Now, it's not only stars that are formed here, it's all solid bodies, including planets. And they may be captured by the stars to form the weird assortment, over 3,500 of them so far, of exoplanetary systems that have been observed. New stars also may fission to produce hot Jupiters in very close orbits and achieve electrical stability with their changing electrical environment. The movement of the filaments, as I said, is like those in a plasma ball. Heavy elements convect into a cool core. This is interesting because those blue filaments you saw before are the coldest part of the cloud, and this is where the stars are forming. The traditional view is that the stars had to form by gravitational collapse and not lose any of the heat of the collapse, otherwise they couldn't start their nuclear fires. Well, this doesn't require any of that. It was one of the surprises for theorists is that the blue filament I mentioned is the coldest part of the cloud and contains 800 times as much mass as the Sun. This is not a surprise for plasma cosmologists.
And then we have the famous black holes. They never really say a black hole to where exactly, but they are said that they are so powerful that not even light can escape, right? Then why are particles escaping? Check it out.
It is shooting charged particles away from the black hole at the center of M87. It's important for everyone considering an electric universe paradigm to wrap their minds as best they can around the distance involved in these stupendous jets. I mean, how far does light travel in a second? 186,000 miles. How far does it travel in a year? It's something like 5.88 trillion miles. And that's a light year, of course. These distances are typically counted in parsecs. A parsec is 3.26 light years. This jet is 50,000 parsecs. And now it's measured electrically. Measurement of the electric current in a kiloparsec scale jet. Obtaining for the first time a direct determination of a galactic scale electric current 3 times 10 to the 18th amps. It's just unfathomable what is occurring across this unimaginable distance of vacuum in space. Our analysis strongly supports a model where the jet energy flow is mainly electromagnetic. There are no islands in space. Just imagine having to defend the idea that an infinitesimal speck inside that glow to the lower left is producing all of this. The truth is that if you had an electron microscope to look at this image at this scale, you would not see the black hole. And if the image that you did see was brought up and you had another electron microscope to look, you still wouldn't see the black hole. How did it happen that we became so confined theoretically that we are required to look inside that galactic core and ignore the charged particles that constitute a sea of plasma, filling this unbelievable volume of space? And it really is impossible to wrap our minds around that. The result upends our understanding of how heat is transported outwards by the sun. See, it upends our understanding of what we know is happening. They don't question whether what they think they know is actually known, is actually true. Same here, and challenges existing explanations of the formation of sunspots and magnetic field generation, but no fundamental questioning of the nuclear core hypothesis, even though it requires something that is clearly not happening. Coronal heating, this is discussed so much within our circle, I'm not going to make a big deal out of this. I just like the humor of astronomer Jay Pasachoff, saying that it's been solved a dozen times. And since he said that, it's been solved another dozen times. And they continue to solve it. And what they get lasts only weeks or months. I'm going to give a ridiculously elementary example of coronal heating from a radically different vantage point. The vantage point that would emphasize interfacial boundaries between two domains, both of which are contributing to a dynamic event. Here's a candle. Where's the heat, the maximum heat? It's not down at the fuel supply. It's in the interface of the fuel supply and the surrounding oxygen. In 1996, I was caught in a ridiculous debate with some people on an old talk group called Talk Origins, and I said, you know, if you put a candle in space so that you didn't have gravity and you didn't have convection, you'd get a spherical flame, and you would see that the maximum energies are at the boundary of that fuel and the surrounding oxygen. And it just happened a couple years ago that in this International Space Station, they put a candle, and that's exactly what you do get here. That is an example of interfacial dynamics that can be applied to the electric sun, where you do not get to ignore the surrounding contribution of the plasma environment to the heat of the sun and all of the electromagnetic emissions of the sun and all of the layers of the sun's atmosphere with such different levels of constancy and variability. Polar jets that they help to complete the image of a dollar-sized magnet here, but this is not new. I mean, Birkeland's experiment gave you polar jets and essentially gave you the core or the focal point of the hourglass form that has been hypothesized by the electric sun proponents, and you see in such nebula as the butterfly nebula. The torus that Birkeland produced in his lab is such a beautiful example of the relationship between experimentation and theory. Forget the math until you have got a basis in observation and experiment to direct the mathematicians. Discharging from the torus to the sphere, the magnetized sphere of his Turella, you see the polar jets there. And by golly, the sun has a torus also, projected into an axial view. And notice this. How does it occur that the equatorial atmosphere rotates 36 times for every 25 times of the circumpolar rotation? How would something driving the sun from within produce superrotation at the outer layer and at the equator? I mean, actually, you're looking here at two levels of differential rotation, because it's not just the equatorial atmosphere that is rotating fast, it's rotating faster than the surface below. Now, Wal Thornhill got me to thinking about something. This was a number of years back. He said, the sunspot appears to be, if you follow Birkeland's experiments, the location of a discharge moving right through the visible layer of the sun's atmosphere. I was looking at this and I thought, well, this is interesting. It looks to me as if that discharge is parting the waves, you might say, and anchoring to a slower moving subsurface layer. And for that reason, it is resisting being moved along by the super-rotating equatorial atmosphere of the sun. I just think things of this sort, these stand in such total and self-evident defiance of a standard model, that you have to begin looking from an interdisciplinary vantage point, complemented by increasingly specialized research. You have to begin looking at a new picture of the sun from the ground up, because what we were given 70 years ago has failed every test. Perfect example, again, of the experimental approach and its impact on the future of science was the work of Christian Birkeland, who said,
our Earth's aurora is being produced by charged particles from the sun entering the upper atmosphere of our Earth.
Sidney Chapman, a mathematician and dean of the Earth-Sun relationship studies, said the Earth was insulated by its magnetosphere, and charged particles could not enter the upper atmosphere of the Earth directly. And then in the 70s, we discovered that charged particles from the sun were indeed entering the Earth's upper atmosphere. And now we call those particle streams Birkeland currents in honor of the experimentalist. We have looked closely enough to see that the currents are moving in cylindrical forms, and ironically, Don Scott has produced a recent paper, which I hope people will have a chance to access in the next few months, that gives the mathematical basis for this cylindrical or embedded cylindrical form of the auroras of Earth. There are no islands in space, and certainly anyone who has followed the evidence for the Earth-Sun connection, the circuitry connecting both bodies, would have to agree that you're not looking at islands.
If the sun had nuclear fusion at its core, that would mean that it would burn at a uniform rate, top to bottom, North Pole to South Pole, throughout its lifetime, when in fact the sun is a variable star. That means it has more power at times than it does at others. It has a 22-year cycle. It has two 11-year cycles. If it were a new core star, the cycles would not exist. Check it out.
Through one solar cycle, the sun virtually blinks out. Additionally, you have in X-rays this equally profound regional variation. And we have to reflect on how could it happen that a thermonuclear core would produce, by heat transferred outward, a uniquely stable photosphere. And then as you rise into higher elevations, you get profound variability of emissions. What is causing that variability? Well, here's something that bears directly on that kind of question, and the line you see there is a voltage curve that was initially produced by Ralph Jurgens, a brilliant engineer who is, you might say, the father of the electric sun hypothesis.
Supernovas. Stars are supposed to go through a certain set of stages, but that's not what we're seeing in the universe.
It's in an old elliptical galaxy in a region where there are no stars being born. So this raises some questions at the end of the article. It says, is this a runaway star from another star formation site? Is it a very local bit of star formation? Is it a different way for such a supernova to occur? None of these seems very likely, so we have a real puzzle. Well, the problem stems from the theory of stars themselves. In fact, the models of stars are so complex that they are non-predictive. One wag suggested you could just as easily come up with a koala bear as a star from the complexity of the theory. The other thing is that a supernova explosion is not really understood. It's a very clever model, but it's totally beyond belief. You have a star which suddenly switches off a theoretical engine at the center, its nuclear furnace, and it suddenly implodes. So this requires the switch off to be sudden, and not only that, the implosion then has to rebound to form the explosion. Of course, this kind of model you would expect would form a spherical shell of material racing away from the star. But what do we see when we look at supernovae? Generally, they have an axis along which matter is ejected. So it's not spherical, the explosion. So this is another puzzle. In fact, it was June last year, it was reported that supercomputer models of supernovae failed to explode. All they did was to implode and collapse. So it's not surprising that astronomers are puzzled. This particular supernova shows a high degree of helium, which also is unexpected. So it was even suggested that perhaps this particular supernova was another type which is due to white dwarfs exceeding a certain mass and then exploding. And so they said maybe it was a collision of two white dwarfs, one of which was helium-rich. So you can see these special conditions that are being introduced in order to try and explain this supernova. Now, it's just a couple of years ago that I had published in the IEEE Transactions on Plasma Science my explanation of supernova 1987A, which shows structure. It showed 3 rings which were centered on an axis through the star, and these rings were made of bright beads. The one nearest the star, encircling where the star was, were very bright, and those further away were dimmer. But this kind of structure is just not explained by any theory of an exploding star.
Much of the strange and encumbered reasoning behind the standard supernova theory may be resolved if a supernova is reinterpreted as an electrical discharge.
In the electric universe model of stars, the complex chemistry to produce the heavy elements inside the star is unnecessary in a supernova. The idea is, of course, that there are populations of stars, and the first population of stars exploded and threw all of the heavier elements out into space where they were collected to make the second population of stars. Now, this is a very messy and inefficient way of producing the stars that we see in our own galaxy, for instance. Also, wherever you look, astronomers are finding anomalies in chemical compositions of stars, stars that shouldn't be there. They're the wrong age, the wrong population. Recently, looking at globular clusters, they've been puzzled by the chemical composition of those stars because it was thought they must have all been produced at the same time in the same event, and yet they're finding compositions which don't fit that picture. In the electric universe, all stars produce heavy elements at their surface, in their photospheres, where strong electrical discharge activity is taking place. And of course, on Earth in the laboratory, this is exactly the way we produce isotopes and heavier elements in the laboratory, is by electric power applied to accelerators. So there's nothing mysterious there. The standard model, on the other hand, requires purely theoretical and untestable things to be going on unseen inside stars. When it comes to star exploding, the electrical model is simplicity itself, and it doesn't require the star to be of any particular age, because in the electrical model, of course, electrical power is supplied to all stars and is the source of their light and heat and the radiation from them. Now, Hans Alfvén pointed out that the circuits in space also include what are called double layers, where charge is separated across a very small region of space. Those double layers can act like a switch, and if that switch is thrown, then the circuit is broken, and all of the energy stored in the magnetic fields of that circuit, which can extend far beyond the star into the galaxy itself, is concentrated on that double layer, that switch. And that switch can actually be at the surface of a star. So a supernova explosion is purely an electrical explosion. It's the kind of thing that has been photographed, and you can see on YouTube, when high voltage transmission power lines, the circuit is opened at an inappropriate time, and a huge arc stretches between the two electrodes as they separate. So you could say that what you're looking at in a supernova explosion is the opening of a stellar switch, when that star suddenly brightens to the point where it can outshine all of the rest of the stars in that galaxy.
One of the most interesting phenomena in the sky is the so-called pulsar. A pulsar is an object that is observed to put out pulses, both of light and radio activity, RF, in the RF spectrum. And those pulses are extremely rapid. They are something like milliseconds apart. So it's like a extremely fast strobe light. And thinking of a strobe light, astronomers immediately leapt to the lighthouse kind of analogy. Something that must be spinning around, the beam is going around, and it's going around so quickly that this thing goes flash, flash, flash. Well, once the repetition rate of the pulsars was observed to get up to in the millisecond range, that meant that this star that was putting out this beam of radiation would have had to be rotating at 300 times a second. And 300 times a second, we're talking about the speed of a dentist drill. So the astronomers decided, well, normal stars couldn't possibly rotate at that speed, and so they postulated the existence of what they called a neutron star. A neutron star is a star that is so dense that it holds together so well that it can indeed rotate at the speed of a dentist's drill. Well, the problem is that in nuclear chemistry, we know that you can't pack neutrons together that densely. They will all fly apart instantaneously. There's a principle called the island of stability in nuclear chemistry that absolutely prevents that. So here again we have the standard astronomers or astrophysicists going directly against another well-developed science. In the electrical model, however, there's a very simple explanation for pulsars. Everybody is familiar with the idea that the pulses can travel back and forth on electrical transmission lines. Such uncontrolled pulses, for example, were responsible for the famous northeast blackouts. A similar effect can occur between two binary stars connected by a plasma. The two binary stars act like capacitors that store charge. And if you reduce that in size to something you can produce in the laboratory, you can produce it in the laboratory, and it's called a relaxation oscillator. And electrical engineers use it and have used it for decades. The idea of producing pulses every few milliseconds is a sophomore level experiment in an electrical engineering laboratory. It doesn't require neutronium, strange matter, or any other fictitious device. All it requires is two capacitors, a battery, and a nonlinear resistor. And we maintain that that's exactly what a binary pair of stars connected by a plasma field presents. A typical ion in the solar wind, hydrogen nucleus, moving about 20 kilometers per second, which is relatively slow for the ions in the solar wind, in the magnetic field of the sun, experiences potentially magnetic forces that are something like 10 million times the strength of the gravitational force on that same ion from the sun. An interesting demonstration that illustrates very readily the relative strength of magnetic force and gravitational force is the simple idea of a ball bearing sitting on a wooden table. The entire mass of the Earth is pulling downward on that little ball bearing, and that's what prevents it from flying out into space. But a child can come along with a little horseshoe magnet and click, pick that ball bearing up instantly.
So far, standard model is batting a whopping 0. It's almost impossible to believe. It's almost as if, well, if we're going to be wrong on one thing, let's be wrong on everything, and then we can just blame the other people because it'll be so whack that the problem will have to be with them. I don't know, I'm just guessing. The big picture, the settled science. And here's just a few of the things that they have wrong. The Big Bang hypothesis is almost surely wrong, where nothing exploded. The expanding universe. Holt and Art proved that redshift was intrinsic. It does not have to do with running away. Dark energy, phantom, fudge factor. Galaxy formation, which is a good one. Dark matter, same thing. Black holes, I know they took a picture of one, didn't they? Yeah, they've done that about 3 or 4 times lately. That's a plasmoid. It's not a black hole. Now, how come it is they never could get a picture of one until just recently, when they feel threatened? Nebular theory, neutron stars. Island of stability does not allow neutrons to hold together. That's why they call it a pulsar now. But some people still call it neutron star. Supernova theory. Wrong. Protoplanetary disk. Thermonuclear sun. Isolated heliosphere. Planet formation. Uniformitarianism. Planetary stability. Snowball comets. Asteroids. And human origins. They're in the hole right now. The big picture of space, gravity alone rules the cosmos. That's their big picture. And that gravity's behavior must be interpreted through the lens of relativity theory. We got a little recording by... This is a quasi-famous scientist that you may or may not know who he is, but I disguise his voice so I don't make it obvious.
Well, I've been, other faculty members at times within Boston University, not within my particular college or division, but like any big universities, there are numerous colleges and schools within the university, and people in an archaeology department in another college within the university, for instance, have denied that I'm a faculty member at Boston University. They did this behind my back in Egypt, for instance, and thought it would never get back to me. They've been very nasty. They've tried to get me fired, some of them. They've tried to make life miserable for me. I mean, what has protected me, and I think I'm in better shape now, last quarter century since I got involved in this whole business about 1990 when I first went to Egypt. And the early days of coming out, it was very difficult. A lot of criticism, a lot of nasty name calling. Academics can be very bitter, very nasty, very petty. There's a lot of vested interest, a lot of egos get bruised. So I've seen my share.
Theoreticians are still trying to look at it through, a friend of mine says they're peering through the wrong end of the telescope and telling us what they imagine they see.
Than gravity. And the answer is that through the years we've used optical telescopes, but recently we have what are called radio telescopes, and we've broadened the spectrum that we can look at the sky with. And those radio telescopes can measure electric currents and magnetic fields, and we can determine from those measurements the strength of the electric currents, the strength of the forces involved, and the amount of energy that's stored out there in space.
The two major pillars of modern cosmology are based on the theories of relativity and quantum theory, and yet, as Einstein himself noted, the two are incompatible. And that may be because the theories of relativity deal with matter as if its only consequence is the bending of space. The electric universe, on the other hand, deals with the electrical structure of matter at the subatomic level and then works its way up through living systems, if you like, planets, stars, galaxies, and the entire universe, and shows that it is the electrical structure of matter that forms the amazing shapes we see in deep space. You begin to see arcs and sparks, if you like, electrical discharge phenomena. The standard theory of comets comes from the view that the solar system was formed from a rotating cloud of gas and dust, and that the planets, in some fashion as yet unexplained completely, formed from most of that gas and dust, but there were leftovers. And the leftovers are beyond sight, outside the solar system, in a hypothetical Oort cloud, as it's called. We have no observational evidence for such a cloud. The electric universe model of comets is that they are actually parts of well-differentiated planetary bodies that have in the past suffered from electrical plasma discharge machining, and that some of the surface material has been lofted into space, so it is expected to be rocky. The second thing is that because comets trace an elongated orbit, both away from the sun and towards the sun, in that trajectory its charge changes, its voltage changes. Since it spends most of its time in the outer solar system, the voltage that it has reflects the voltage in the outer solar system. But as it hurtles towards the sun, as it enters towards the Earth's orbit, the voltage is changing rapidly, and the comet has to respond to that by beginning to discharge. And that's where we see the familiar cometary phenomena of the coma and the various tails that it produces.
Some of the natural consequences of electric cosmology are the patterns that we see, both in the laboratory and in the sky. A very good example of this is the work of Dr. Anthony Peratt, who was a graduate student of the very famous Hannes Alfvén, who was really the father of electric cosmology. Peratt simulated on a supercomputer using just a cloud of electrical charges and a magnetic field, just using the laws of electrical science, not using anything to do with gravity. He simulated what looked like a spiral galaxy. And the interesting thing is that Perat's spiral galaxy in the laboratory had exactly the same rotational properties as the real spiral galaxies that we see in the sky do.
The sun just dominates our sky as the source of light and warmth and life itself on Earth. And this preeminence of the sun is so clear and obvious that it remains a mystery why virtually every ancient culture insisted that before the present sun, there was a quite different luminary ruling the sky. The central sun, the superior sun, the best sun, the motionless sun. And all of these cultures, whatever may be the meaning of these traditions, are insisting that the sky has changed. Of course, our ideas about the sun have continually changed. Only a few centuries ago, the sun was a campfire or ember in the sky. Then early in the 20th century, under the influence of gravitational theory, the sun was seen as a gravitationally collapsing nebular cloud. In the atomic age, astronomers began to visualize the sun in terms of a nuclear furnace hidden at its core. But now we're in the age of plasma science, with discoveries of the electric currents in space. And it's inconceivable that these discoveries would not change the picture of the sun again.
Plasma cosmologists have been able to demonstrate experimentally and also in the supercomputer that galaxies are an electrical phenomenon, which raises the question about stars, and in particular our own sun, which is the closest star to the Earth, of course. Any theory of the sun has to explain how it could continue to burn for billions of years, and also explain its present size based on its known mass. And of course, as soon as nuclear energy was discovered, it was grasped immediately as the energy source of the sun. But all of that assumes that the sun is disconnected and an isolated body, and that it must consume itself over its lifetime to provide the heat and light that we receive from it. But if the sun is connected to the rest of the galaxy in an electrical sense, it doesn't require to burn itself at all. And the energy that we receive is actually being received from the galaxy, and the sun is acting as a focus for that energy.
The sun is actually a fairly typical star. And so if we want to understand stars and cosmology, we really have to understand the sun. And the standard model of the sun, so-called, that astronomers are so very proud of these days, really doesn't explain very much about the sun. Why is there a corona in the first place? Everybody knows about the corona, the beautiful corona that we see during solar eclipses. Why is it there? It's clearly an electrical phenomenon.
One of the greatest puzzles about the sun has been, with a surface temperature of 6,000 degrees, high above that surface we have temperatures of millions of degrees. And the question has been, how do we get the energy from the center of the sun somehow past that surface to heat the upper atmosphere of the sun to millions of degrees? In the electric model, you don't have that problem, because if the energy is arriving from outside the sun, the first place you expect to see that energy expressed is above the sun in its tenuous atmosphere. And that is the place where particle acceleration occurs, and the apparent temperature goes very high indeed, up into the millions of degrees.
The fact that the particles in the solar wind accelerate, that is to say, increase their velocity with increasing distance away from the sun, The farther away they get, the faster they go. And the fact that those particles are indeed charged particles leads me, as an electrical engineer, to come to the immediate conclusion that this is an electrical process. In the solar model, think of the sun as being a positive anode, very high voltage body that obviously would emanate an electric field. And if you put a charged particle in an electric field, it will accelerate. That's the way we accelerate particles here on Earth. It's the way every physicist and electrodynamicist has ever increased the velocity of a charged particle, is put it in an electric field.
One of the features we observe on the sun, which have no business being there, according to the standard model, are sunspots. The most significant thing about a sunspot is the fact that the center of the sunspot is dark. And if the sun is trying to radiate energy from its core into space, we should expect that it is bright.
And if you think about that umbra, that darkest place in the center of sunspots, that's the place where we can see deepest into the sun. And just consider the fact that at that point where we can really see down into the sun, that's the absolute coldest place that we are able to measure. If the center of the sun is really a nuclear fusion furnace, it should be the hottest because we're closest to the source, and it's not the case. If you ask any astronomer, why are there sunspots, why are the umbra dark, they will blame it on some sort of warped, twisted magnetic fields. They will say that it has to do with the solar dynamo, all of which lurk unseen like a big genie somewhere below the surface. These phenomena are only to be expected if the sun is electrical in nature. Astrophysicists make the claim that the solar fusion model has indeed been tested in the laboratory, and nothing really is further from the truth. Although each of the steps involved in the hydrogen to helium fusion reaction have indeed been verified experimentally, the overall experiment, the overall reaction, has never been produced in a continuous laboratory experiment. Continuous hydrogen to helium fusion has not been attained in the lab. The strength, in fact, of the electric cosmology is that indeed all of the mechanisms that the electrical people talk about have indeed been verified over decades, in fact, at least a century, in the laboratory. The plasma scaling is well known, and plasma and electrical experiments have verified every step of the way. There are any number of observations that are have ad hoc present explanations, but really have no explanation in the standard model, and are natural consequences of the electrical model. For example, heavy elements, the solar spectrum, the neutrino deficiency, the neutrino variability, solar atmosphere, differential rotation by latitude, differential rotation by depth, equatorial plasma torus, sunspots, sunspot migration, the sunspot penumbra, and the sunspot cycle itself. Magnetic field strength, the even magnetic field, helioseismology, the solar density, and the changing size. All of the observations that in that list are natural consequences of the electrical sun model. Standard astronomers tend to pass them off as being inconsequential difficulties that will eventually someday be solved. I maintain, and so do our colleagues here, that these are not inconsequential, but are rather death blows to the solar fusion model, because they are important. They're not secondary. They're primary falsifying observations for that failed nuclear fusion model.
Do you know where the current solar model theory came from? Walt Thornhill tells the story better than I ever could, so I'll let him tell you.
Phys.org, titled Stellar Mystery Deepens, a Monash University-led research team made an unexpected discovery that a large group of stars are dying prematurely, challenging our accepted view of stellar evolution. Their results revealed that large numbers of helium-burning stars are dying prematurely in the M4 globular cluster. Professor Latanzio from the Max Planck Institute for Astrophysics said, "Globular clusters are some of the oldest objects in the universe. Although we have some ideas for what is going on in them, every time we look carefully we find something unexpected. They are both fascinating and frustrating at the same time." The international team found that about half of the stars tend to skip the red giant phase, instead becoming white dwarfs millions of years ahead of schedule. Demonstrating once again what's wrong with the modern scientific method, characterized as shut up and simulate, Professor Latanzio continued, "Computer simulations do not agree with this observation. So, as well as continuing observations, new computer models will need to be generated to better understand what is taking place in the cores of these stars. But the computer models are built on missing or invalid concepts. There's nothing going on in the cores of stars, and globular clusters are not understood. So the mathematical computer simulations produce a virtual, unreal cosmos that, like the movies, can be programmed to produce anything you can imagine. And the artist's impressions we see in science reports are little more than glossy advertising material, but much more deceptive because it is falsely labelled real science. There is no real mystery here. With no nuclear fire inside, stars don't die by bloating to a red giant and collapsing to a white dwarf as their fire goes out. The life and death stories of stars are fictional. The bloated appearance of red giants is not due to internal pressure caused by hypothetical helium burning at 100 million degrees in the core of a star. It is a purely electrical effect witnessed in laboratory low-pressure gas discharge tubes. Red stars are those that satisfy their need for electrons from the surrounding plasma by expanding the surface area over which they collect electrons by growing a large plasma sheath that becomes the effective anode in space. The growth process is self-limiting because as the sheath expands, its electric field grows stronger. Electrons caught up in the field are accelerated until they become energetic enough to excite neutral particles they chance to collide with, and the huge sheath becomes a uniform red anode glow. It becomes a red giant star. The electric field driving this process will also give rise to a massive flow of positive ions away from the star, or in more conventional terms, a prodigious stellar wind. Such loss of matter is a characteristic feature of red giants. Standard stellar theory is at a loss to explain this since the star is said to be too cold to boil off a stellar wind. Arthur Eddington himself expressed his puzzlement about white dwarfs. Strange objects which persist in showing a type of spectrum entirely out of keeping with their luminosity may ultimately teach us more than a host which radiates according to rule. He was right. A white dwarf appears extremely hot, white and underluminous because it is a faint white coronal discharge. As usual, a thin plasma sheath will be formed between the plasma of the star and the plasma of space. The electric field across the plasma sheath is capable of accelerating electrons to generate ultraviolet light and X-rays when they hit atoms in the atmosphere, and the power dissipated is capable of raising the temperature of a thin plasma layer to tens of thousands of degrees. The spectral lines are broadened, sometimes to the point of disappearance, due to the coronal electric field. This gives the misleading impression that hydrogen, whose spectral lines are smeared the most, is missing in many of these stars, and that therefore they are remnants of larger stars that have conventionally lost or burned their hydrogen fuel. So, globular clusters are not some of the oldest objects in the universe. Their spherical shape of a dense collection of stars and their elliptical orbits about the galactic centre hint at a quasar-style birth process from the plasmoid at the heart of the galaxy. If so, the electromagnetic environment inside the globular cluster is different to that in open clusters of stars, so we should expect an unusual distribution of white dwarfs and red giant stars. And the puzzling observation that some globular cluster stars have 100 times more iron than others could also be explained by electromagnetic sorting of elements within the globular cluster at its birth. The fact we don't understand stars in the 21st century highlights what Arthur Koestler wrote in The Sleepwalkers. The history of cosmic theories in particular may without exaggeration be called a history of collective obsessions and controlled schizophrenia, and the manner in which some of the most important individual discoveries were arrived at reminds one more of a sleepwalker's performance than an electronic brain's. Science is still in its childhood, and we behave as infants. We give far too much credit to scientists for knowing what they are talking about.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
Mechanism. Of course, the astronomer's got it back to front. If you do a mirror image, then you have a more understandable arrangement where the stars get brighter and bluer as you increase the current density, so that you get this straight line curve, which is exactly what you'd expect. Red stars have to expand. That's both red dwarfs and red giants. They're stars which are not collecting enough electricity to satisfy the discharge, so plasma adjusts. It's like a living thing almost. It adjusts to its environment. And so it expands the anode sheath to collect enough current. And some of those anode sheaths are monstrous. You know, Betelgeuse, if that star was in our solar system, its photosphere reaches out to the orbit of Jupiter. White dwarfs, on the other hand, may be normal-sized star, but they have no bright photosphere. Their upper atmosphere is in direct contact with the plasma of space. They have only a faint white corona. Imagine if the sun's photosphere turned off, you would see this white envelope, very faint, but very white, very high temperature in appearance. So stellar evolution is a fairy story. This is V838 Monocerotis. This erupting star transformed itself over a period of months from a small underluminous star, a little hotter than the sun, to a highly luminous, cooled supergiant star undergoing rapid and complex brightness changes. This was the quote of the article describing it. The transformation defies the conventional understanding of stellar life cycles. It's a very complex story. I've been through it, the theory of it. So here's a red giant. This is actually Betelgeuse. It's 500 times the size of the sun, and it has a hotspot. You've got to ask yourself, you know, what's a hotspot doing on a red giant star? What happens is as that envelope expands, the electric field grows stronger because it's trying to collect electrons from space. But on the other hand, positively charged particles, in other words, its stellar wind, are accelerated more strongly the other way. So you have this anomaly where these cool stars have the most powerful winds known. And if the stellar wind is being boiled off, so to speak, this doesn't make any sense at all. And Betelgeuse sports a hot spot, and I've suggested it may be above one of its poles because one of the Alphane circuits shows that one of the connections of the electric circuit is to the poles of the star. So we may be staring at one of the poles. Giants and dwarfs, the usual story is that stars consume their fuel and change to giants or dwarfs. The story is complex, unverifiable, and regularly contradicted. This is another version of the HR diagram there. And astronomers are perpetually astonished by unexpected changes in stars. This is a white dwarf system. Sirius B is the white dwarf, and Sirius A, you'll see an optical light here. Sirius A is very bright in the sky, and Sirius B is almost invisible, and it's a faint white, so-called white dwarf. Now, if you look at it in X-rays, it's the reverse. Here's Sirius B, it's brighter than its optically bright partner Sirius A. This is what you'd expect, where the discharge reaches into the ionosphere directly of a star. The X-ray output is high, the visual light output is low. There's nothing special about that. It can be an ordinary star. It's just that its partner may have usurped most of the current. It's supposed to be a collapsed star at the end of its fuel. But how can an old and a young star be together? Because here you have an old and a young star, so to speak, under the conventional ideas, together. A white dwarf has no bright photosphere. Its white light and X-rays come from an intense corona. Here's the different star types, and I've shown how I think they would look. A red dwarf is actually quite large. In other words, it's like a red giant in miniature. A red dwarf was discovered, and the astronomers decided that it was putting out too much light for what they assumed was a dwarf star. So they said, oh, it must be a pair of red dwarfs of exactly the same size and power output. I suggested, no, it's a single red dwarf. It's just much bigger than anyone ever expected. Main sequence star, it is covered with photospheric tufting, tufted anode and a controlled discharge. Blue giants are a large star under high electrical stress. Red giants are a normal star under low electrical stress, and it develops a bloated glowing plasma sheath. A white dwarf is a normal star in direct contact with space plasma and has low luminosity. Talking about brown dwarfs, if a brown dwarf gets close to a very bright star, the bright star is at a higher potential than the brown dwarf. That brown dwarf will actually switch off as a star and become a comet. It switches from being an anode in the discharge system to being a cathode, and there are quite distinct differences. Now, if the Earth, hypothetically here, if the Earth was a satellite of a brown dwarf, that radiating shell would be quite enormous. You could have all of the satellites of that object, that small star, orbiting within that envelope. That whole radiating envelope puts energy on the surface of any orbiting planet equally on every square metre. So that you would have no seasons, no day and night, and you'd receive ultraviolet light. This refers to what Dwight was talking about the other day with the earliest memories of mankind. It suggests that we were in this situation, and astronomers in recent years have come to the conclusion that this is the more likely place for life to thrive. Where we are now is much more precarious. So brown dwarfs don't hang out with stars because electrically it's impossible. The other thing is that these brown dwarfs, unexpectedly, they flare. They throw material off occasionally because they've got no means of controlling their discharge other than to get rid of material, matter, charged matter. So that any satellites of these brown dwarfs gets occasionally drowned in water, an atmosphere, and also solid materials to cause layering on them. Brown dwarfs flare and deposit layered minerals on their satellites. There's a few more logical leaps involved in the electric universe, and I'll just go through a few of them. I asked the question, is gravity a weak electric dipole-to-dipole force between distorted subatomic particles? And this refers to something that Velikovsky said to me when I visited him, and also to Ralph Sainsbury's view that all subatomic particles have an orbital structure, a resonant orbital structure. And as Ralph has pointed out, magnetism then is also an electric dipole-to-dipole force due to transverse distortion of electrons or protons accelerated in an electric field. If so, the electric force is the only force necessary in physics, and this goes back to the way classical physics operated by trying to reduce the number of forces and ideas. And quantum effects imply that all matter has a resonant electrical substructure. Information and energy can be stored and transferred via these matter resonances, and that has significance in biological systems too. So astrophysical and biological coherence requires universal, near-instantaneous electrical interactions. All of the so-called spooky quantum things are no longer spooky if we accept this idea. We have a return of the ether. We must have particles to be able to transfer the energy and the forces through so-called empty space. Empty space, I suggest, is full of neutrinos. Neutrinos are the lowest energy state of matter. They exhibit vanishingly small mass. They're composed of subtrons, which is what Ralph called them. They form electric dipoles, that is the neutrinos, in an electric field, and each dipole rotates in the electromagnetic field of a light wave. That ties the speed of light in a vacuum to the moment of inertia of a neutrino. And neutrinos may reintroduce cause and effect to radioactive decay. At present, it's a purely statistical phenomenon. The other thing is that it also solves the difficulty of the so-called annihilation and creation of matter in particle accelerators. You cannot do it, but if the neutrinos are the substrate, they can accept energy and become a particle and its mirror particle. I don't use the word antiparticle because there's no such thing. It's all matter, normal matter. I put these few slides on the end because there was discussion about Venus and the transfer of charge, and I think it's important because it returns Velikovsky's gauntlet to him cordially. Velikovsky argued that planets change orbits, exchange thunderbolts and quickly settle into peaceful orbits. Now, rapid settling after chaos defies Newton's laws, which, of course, that was the argument levelled against Velikovsky, which for more than a two-body gravitational system are chaotic anyway. So the astronomers have yet to explain why we have a stable solar system. So astronomers simply ignored the gauntlet flung down by Velikovsky. Then we have Anthony Peratt and the convergence of his work with ours some few years ago. And he showed, globally, petroglyphs show to a high degree of confidence that within human existence the Earth has suffered stupendous electric discharge phenomena from the heavens. And that's a picture of one of his papers. Now, if we accept Velikovsky's gauntlet, we need to look at Newton's law of gravity again and just have a think about what it really means. You'll notice there that G, I put its dimensions there just to show that it does include mass. And if mass is a variable, then we have a problem. It is simply assumed that G is the same for all bodies in the universe. In other words, the universal gravitational constant. And that was an assumption. Stellar and planetary structure and composition is based upon this premise, but if mass is a variable, can it explain cosmic pool? The book over there is by one of the Thunderbolts team, C.J. Ransom, The Age of Velikovsky. Of course, MOND is the latest buzzword in gravity theory, the modified Newton's dynamics. I've suggested that we can have electrically modified Newtonian dynamics. And I won't go through all that business there, you can see it on my website and so on. But the upshot is that the radius of the orbit of a planet is proportional to the mass of the planet if you keep the orbital energy constant and you assume the sun's G is constant, and I think that's a fair assumption. If the mass doubles, the orbital radius must double to conserve orbital energy. Now, I said earlier that all planets and stars and all celestial objects will form an electret. In other words, you have positive poles facing inwards and negative poles facing outwards. So it sets up an internal electric field. The planet acts like an electret. And any free electrons would tend to drift towards the surface. Like a subatomic particle under the stress of an electric field, the internal electrical stress modifies the apparent mass of the planet or star, and therefore its gravity. Exchanging charge at the surface through lightning, etc., changes the mass or gravity of a planet. And there is evidence for that. Coronal mass ejections, large ones which strike the Earth, actually change the rate of spin of the Earth suddenly, and then it decays back to its original speed, which is diagnostic of a change of the moment of inertia of the Earth by some means which hasn't been explained. Comet accelerations also. Cometry displays an obvious electric discharge phenomenon. Any body on an eccentric orbit about the Sun will experience discharge activity. The discharge will cause apparent non-Newtonian acceleration, and this is well known with comets. They're very hard to predict their precise return because of them. And this is because the mass of the comet is changing, something that's not taken into any account. However, gravity is still the operative force, but here we have a feedback mechanism which can modify orbits. So, changing planetary mass. The closer the encounter between two planets, and the more powerful the charge exchange between planets, the greater the orbital adjustments. It seems an efficient mechanism for collision avoidance and spacing the planetary orbits apart, which may explain one of the reasons why we survived Velikovsky's catastrophic scenario. The inner planet reduces its charge polarization, its mass, and the outer planet increases its polarization mass in the exchange. And I ask the question, is this possible? Yes, I believe it is. Because some years ago it was reported that a spacecraft here, the SOHO spacecraft, picked up stringy things, stringy plasma things, arriving from Venus when it was between us and the Sun. Now those stringy things, of course, are recognised immediately as Birkeland currents, and the Birkeland currents transfer electrons from Venus to the Earth. At present it has little or no effect on the Earth because of the distance and the low current density. So there's an intermittent circuit for transferring electrons from the inner planet to the outer when they're aligned with the Sun. The charge transfer is in the correct sense to induce the planets to move apart into orbits having electrical least interaction. Quickly it will appear as though the system operates according to Newton's laws with no sign of recent instability, and that was the problem that Velikovsky faced, and it was the question I asked him when I visited him. How do we deal with this problem? And I think this is the answer, or part of the answer. And we come to the Sagnac Award winner, and I consider a great man, a modern Galileo. Dr. Halton Arp embraces a plasma universe. I think it's a very apt photograph. Also, I might say there are a lot of interesting issues raised by Halton Arp's discoveries that fit neatly in an electric universe solution. For example, intrinsic quantized redshift and an increase of mass with time were explained by an electrical origin for particle masses and their resonant quantized states. Because the quasars are ejected from a galaxy, the electrons are tangled up in the plasmoid at the centre of a galaxy for far longer than the neutrons, which can escape because they're uncharged, and the protons, which are heavier. So that quasars are electron deficient initially, which means that all of their energy levels of all their matter will function at a lower level. Their fine structure constant will be different, their redshift spectrum will be enhanced, but over time, as the electrons stream out in those great jets that we see, both the mass increases, but it does so in resonant steps, quantized steps, and the brightness increases because the electrical energy arriving is increasing. And so this explains this very strange phenomenon where a quasar ejected at very high speeds from the centre of an active galaxy can actually slow down and go into orbit about its parent. So this is the quasar mass gain. You can see this is one of Arp's diagrams of the birth and the development of quasars into companion galaxies. Intrinsic redshift, an increase in mass of subatomic particles equals an increase in the orbital energies of electrons within atoms in the quasar. That results in a decrease in redshift of the quasar. And since subatomic particles are resonant systems of charge, the redshift must decrease in quantum jumps. Now, any explanation for this kind of intrinsic redshift gets over the problems that you face if you try to talk about the medium between us and the quasar, because you cannot quantize, as far as I can imagine, the redshift by anything that occurs between us and the emitting object, but it's intrinsic to the emitting object.
Now it's time to take a little look at the plasma aspect of the universe. And here's Mr. Eric Lerner, author of the book The Big Bang Never Happened.
These themselves form. Some people have said that science is a method for asking questions of nature. And if that's true, then we can say the Big Bang supporters are people who won't take no for an answer.
2 or 3 decades, the Big Bang theory has become increasingly more and more speculative. One expects from a scientific theory definite predictions which can be tested by observations. If the observations disprove the predictions, that theory is supposed to be disproved, and it should be modified or abandoned.
In science, we work from observation, from empirical observation that starts in the here and now and works outwards and backwards. The Big Bang starts from mathematical formulas, deductions that start from the beginning of the universe and to try and predict it forward. This is the same mathematical approach, mathematical deductive approach, that led 2,000 years ago to the development of the Ptolemaic universe. The universe, of course, which was Earth-centered, with the planets going around the Earth, with the stars in a crystalline sphere. What these theories have in common is that they try and derive what should be the universe, based on what perfect principles we can develop, what God should have made the universe to look like. And then they try to fit the universe into that perfect framework.
However, what has happened over the years is that whenever observations have come up which don't agree with the predictions of the Big Bang theory, the theory adds an extra assumption which is not at all tested, which is not at all resting on conventional physics, and simply assumes that that must be true.
The problem with that is that develops myth, not science. It develops a religious faith in which nothing in the real world, in the observable world, can contradict the faith in this structure, in the Big Bang. This undermines the entire scientific enterprise. The reason science has been valuable to human beings is because it allows us to predict nature in such a way as we can use nature in a predictable fashion in technology. To abandon this approach, which has served us so well, and to go to the idea that we can deduce, we can read the mind of God, as Stephen Hawking says, and deduce from perfect mathematical principles what the universe must be, is to abandon the scientific method. The Big Bang has handled the cosmic microwave background. It's a very good example of how this process works.
To put it in. So you look and it's there, so you put it in. That's that. It isn't an explanation.
First of all, the temperature of the microwave background, basically the amount of energy, was not what the Big Bang supporters had predicted. They had predicted a much higher temperature.
So it was 50 degrees Kelvin that was being compared against the 2 to 5 degrees Kelvin from the steady state universe. Now, this may not sound like much, but in energy density, where we measure the absolute differences, the differences is 4 orders of magnitude, 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 difference. So there is an enormous difference between 50 degrees Kelvin, a rather poor indicator of what is happening in the universe, and 3 degrees Kelvin.
When you read the textbooks, they don't tell the whole story. They don't present these figures, 5 greater than 5, 7, 50, and then that they did find 3. So that's very strange how the textbooks, they hide a part of history.
And the temperature of the Big Bang proponents was rapidly readjusted from 50 degrees to 3 degrees.
But their theory could be adjusted so that the temperature becomes a free variable, that it could be just taken as what was observed.
We have an observable universe which is made of stars, galaxies that are not very distant, and that's all, because the 3D radiation, I would even think that it might be local. Still not. And going beyond that is, I think, a wild extrapolation, whatever it is. And physics that we could imagine to be existing there is based on nothing, because we have no test for it.
What was dark matter? Dark matter was some matter that we don't understand, we don't know what it's about, we haven't observed it, but it isn't ordinary matter, so it doesn't enter into our equations about the light elements, and we can't see it as stars. But dark matter is 90 or 99% of the mass of the universe. This is what we call in science a fudge factor. When your equations don't work out, you just write in this little plus something. Well, in this case, this was a humongous fudge factor because it was 90 or 99% of the universe.
And you have to not only postulate that this matter has to exist, but it has to exist in quantities much greater than the amount you see of ordinary matter.
And I should emphasize that people have looked for dark matter. People have looked for dark matter since it was proposed 20 years ago. Axions, WIMPs, little particles that are supposed to be floating around in space that we should, in theory, be able to observe as they pass through the Earth. Dozens of experiments have looked for these particles. Not one has been found. Again, this should be a contradiction. The way science works, you make a prediction, observation contradicts it, the theory should be rejected. But that hasn't happened. And the epicycles don't end. There's a problem with dark matter, even theoretically. Even though we can't observe it, there's still a problem with it, which is dark matter slows down the expansion of the universe. So the length of time that the universe has existed, the length of time since the Big Bang, should be shorter than what's indicated just by linear expansion. The problem is it's too short. The prediction of the cold dark matter theory is that the universe should be about 8 billion years old. Well, that's a big problem. We can determine the age of stars in our own galaxy, in the oldest globular clusters, both based on very well confirmed theories of the nuclear evolution of stars and spectroscopic observation. And the stars in our galaxy are 13 or 14 billion years old. So it's very embarrassing to have 14 billion year old stars in an 8 billion year old universe.
In addition, they went into dark energy. Now, why did dark energy come in? Because if you take the present value of the cosmological constant and the cosmological constant which came out of inflation, you find that they are not the same. Not only they are the same, but you have to find that the difference lies in something like 108 orders of magnitude. Now, can you imagine a physical theory getting the answers wrong by a factor 10 to the power 108? Yet, the Big Bang cosmologists very goodly accept this and simply put in another epicycle by saying that there is a dark energy which has changed over the time by this factor. So we have to accept that.
Dark energy is some force, again, unknown on Earth, unpredicted by any theory that we have validation of here on Earth, that causes an acceleration of the expansion of the universe. So as the universe is accelerating, and it's older than appears on the basis of dark matter theory, and it's 15 billion years old. So we solve the problem of the age of the universe by hypothesizing yet a third completely ad hoc epicycle dark energy. So now we have a universe which is 70% dark energy, 28% dark matter, and only 2% matter that we can observe through our telescopes and here on Earth. Epicycle is being piled onto epicycle. And in the process, what we call the predictive power of the theory is fading away to nothing. One of the most destructive features of the methodology of the Big Bang is that it conveys the idea that only experts can understand the universe. Only people versed in extremely complicated mathematics can understand the universe. That if dark matter, dark energy appear to be incomprehensible or even nonsensical, it's because you don't understand the mathematics of these complex equations. This is, of course, the argument of the emperor's new clothes. If you can't see the emperor's new clothes, then you must be either stupid or incompetent.
And I've heard people decry that can't happen. What you're seeing, don't believe your lying eyes. Believe me, I'm going to tell you what happened. No, that's what really happens. And that's a picture of what the penumbral filaments look like. And it's kind of interesting that I maintain, and you think of it yourself, the umbra is a place where there aren't any tufts. So if you look at a cross-section of this thing, you can see tufts. They're all pushing on each other. You know, the samurai warriors, they don't like each other. But when it comes to the edge of the place where there aren't any tufts, these guys don't have anything to hold them back. So they fall in. And you can see that's happening. The reason I say you can see it happening is concentrate on the circular ring right on the outside of the penumbra, right between the yellow and the, what is it, ochre-colored areas. And you can see that the regular tufts, the yellow area, right near where the tufts are breaking away, are going outward. You see that? And the tufts in the penumbra are going inward. Sure, they hate each other. They're both positive groups of positive charge. They're elbowing each other. And so when the group that is not being held back by anything and just falls off, when it starts to flow, to move, it's still pushing on the other guys. The space is opening up, and so some fall in and some fall away. So I think that is proof, the fact that the yellow ones actually move outward while the other ones are moving inward. When space opens up for them to be able to move, shows that what you're seeing is an electric reaction. It's not a gravitational reaction. At least I maintain it's not. The analogy, of course, is the calving of icebergs. You got a glacier, and you got the ocean or wherever that water is out there, and these things eventually break loose and fall in. In this case, this guy that's falling, in the process of falling in, is not pushing on anything. So there's no tendency for the tufts, if you will, the potential icebergs that are in the wall of the glacier, there's no tendency for them to move away because nothing's pushing on them. Only gravity is pulling the one down that's falling in. This is not the case, so this is a partial analogy. It is sort of like, makes you think about what is happening on the sun, but on the sun, this guy that's falling is pushing back like crazy on the one that he just came away from, and he's moving back. It's going to increase in strength, and the plasma tufts are going to go into the arc mode. You will see the photosphere. There they are. They don't like each other. It's like a bunch of kabuki warriors pushing each other away. They're all positive, and they're all looking for advantage and not finding it. You might hear Monty's voice in the background if they have the audio on. He's increased the current. The tufts have begun to go into, I know whether it's a high glow mode or that's arc mode. You can see now, it's a better model that you can see the sunspots. Sunspots are where there are no tufts. There's something that he's got the excitation such that it looks like the chromosphere. That little black thing in the bottom, I guess, Michael can tell me whether, is that the spectroscopic probe or it's a probe of some sort. There's the corona. The ring around the outside is the cathode. And of course, in the Sapphire model, you need a cathode. But in real space, of course, the cathode is a virtual cathode. But there's the corona. The reason that the corona there looks like it's only on one side is because the anode is closer to the cathode on that spot where you get the corona. If it were equally spaced, you'd see the corona all the way around.
I believe any lasting contribution of the Sapphire project is going to be in its raw data and hard empirical evidence. Correlating the data from Sapphire with the latest data from deep space is not as straightforward as it might sound. The Herschel and Planck millimeter telescopes have sent back new images of our galaxy's interstellar medium that have many in the astronomical community reeling. It is as if you're riding along and someone pulls a wheel off your bicycle. We are struggling to make sense of this data. It simply does not fit with our previous theories. The previous theories need to be abandoned or severely modified. I think we might need new models. Empirical science requires rigorous adherence to strict rules of process and discovery.
Saturn, in the earthly auroras. And critically, it is obvious at the North Pole of Jupiter, where one can see at least 15 counter-rotating cylinders. We asked Dr. Scott for his interpretation of the mysterious electron acceleration in the Jovian aurora.
When you think about it, Birkeland finally, many years after the poor man died, his work was absolutely substantiated by the probes that we sent up into the Earth's atmosphere, upper atmosphere. Birkeland was right that the Earth's auroras were indeed caused by electrical particles, charged particles coming from the sun. Everybody knows that now, but this idea of spiraling, the twisting, the magnetic flux ropes that twist like ropes. Question I should think that they would be asking themselves, and apparently it has never occurred to them to do that, is why is the twist? What causes the twist? Everything in the sky twists. I mean, galaxies rotate, planets rotate, the sun rotates, everything twists, moves, but nothing sits still. Nothing flows like water in a pipe, just straight. Everything is twisting. Everything is in a tornadic kind of movement. And why? I would submit, according to the model that I developed, that is the basic, fundamental property of a Birkeland current is this twisting, this counter-rotation. And that's where all of these motions come from. Apparently, they have observed electric fields out there. Mention of the word voltage, and we're talking about, and they actually put in here 400,000 electron volts, and they said electrons are accelerated in the Jovian atmosphere at energies up to 400,000 electron volts. Well, if it's an electron, that means it's gone through a voltage drop of 400,000 volts. That is a whale of a voltage. I remember being completely laughed at by certain astronomers who have attended our conferences in the past, and there's nothing, no voltage like that out there. I mean, where's the battery? You can't have. Where'd you get a battery of 400,000 volts? Well, and now all of a sudden they see it. Now they're mystified, and had they listened to us and been more cooperative with us maybe years ago, more than just the 2 or 3 years since I published this model, but in years prior to that, and they would have maybe not been quite as surprised as they are. I mean, everybody should realize that the way you get charged particles, for example, a prime candidate, an electron, to accelerate is to put it in an electric field. We put it through a voltage drop. By definition, a voltage is a measure of the potential, the electrical potential energy a positive particle has at a certain point in space. So if you say the voltage at this point is 400,000 volts, that means it's just like a billiard ball or a bowling ball sitting on top of a 400,000 foot mountain. Okay, so now all of a sudden the bowling ball rolls down the mountain. By the time it gets to the bottom of the mountain and has fallen through that distance, man, is it moving. It converts its potential energy, which is voltage, into kinetic energy, which is 1/2 mv squared, 1/2 the mass times the velocity squared. So that even though it's velocity squared, that's still a pretty high velocity. So that's where they're getting these tremendous velocities from. And I think their problem is they don't know where the voltage comes from. I realize, and I think everybody who's interested in plasma cosmology realizes, that strong, very, very strong cosmic currents come not from a battery. There is no 400,000 volt battery out there in space. What there is an induction process when a conductor, and for the word conductor, substitute plasma, because plasma is a very, very good conductor. When a column of plasma moves through a magnetic field, or a magnetic field moves across a plasma, if there's relative motion between plasma and a magnetic field, you will induce a current. And given the magnificent size of this astronomical size of some of these magnetic fields and these plasma fields out there, there's a tremendous potential, and I use the word as a pun, tremendous potential. It's an induced current that gives electrons this tremendous acceleration. If we here in the electric universe are correct, then the entire cosmos, and specifically our solar system as being in the cosmos, is fed by electric currents, Birkeland currents, or at least force-free field-aligned currents, or some type of currents, We know they're out there. We know they're voluminous in their effect. If you think of an electrical resistor, that is a resistor in a piece of wire, if current goes through that resistor, there'll be a larger voltage at the front end of that resistor where the current enters the resistor, and it'll go out at a, you can say a minus sign, where the voltage will be less. So there'll be a voltage drop across that resistor. Okay, well, if you've gone with me that far, how about let's put in parallel, that is to say, connect the top of a capacitor to the plus side of the resistor, and the other end, the other side of the capacitor to the bottom end of the resistor. And now we have what's called a parallel combination of a resistor and a capacitor. That is a good starting point, I think, to think about an object, whether it be the sun or Earth or Jupiter or any other object that is under the influence of an electrical force, electrical currents that go through it. Let's not argue about the sun. We know the sun has those kinds of currents entering and leaving. And the same thing is true about Earth, because we know about the Birkeland current that comes into the North Pole of the Earth. So we know that happens. But if you think about the gizmo that's in the middle, whether it's the sun or the Earth or Jupiter or whatever, as a little parallel combination of a capacitor and a resistor, you can realize that as the current goes down through the resistor and makes that plus minus, plus at the top, let's say if current comes in at the top, plus at the top, minus at the bottom across that resistor, that same voltage is applied to the capacitor. Now, if you apply a voltage to a capacitor, that capacitor will charge up. It will have charge. And so, can a body like Earth be charged? Yes, because it's within the current input that the Birkeland current puts in the North Pole. Actually, Birkeland currents carry currents both ways. There are these cylinders, and you can get current going down in the middle and up on the outside. Bodies can have charge. They do have charge. And they may have a net charge if it's hooked up, as I just described, with across a resistor through which a current is flowing. And there's a voltage drop across the resistor. There will be a voltage drop then across that capacitor. And that means the capacitor will have a net charge. Can a body like Earth be charged? Yes, because it's within the current input that the Birkeland current puts in the North Pole. Actually, Birkeland currents carry currents both ways. There are these cylinders, and you can get current going down in the middle and up on the outside. Bodies can have charge. They do have charge. And they may have a net charge if it's hooked up, as I just described, with across a resistor through which a current is flowing. And there's a voltage drop across the resistor. There will be a voltage drop then across that capacitor. And that means the capacitor will have a net charge.
As science coming to the electric universe through the back door. It is not possible in the vacuum of space to create a magnetic field or to sustain a magnetic field in the absence of electric currents. We're talking about converging evidence, and we can bring the focus down to our own cosmic neighborhood and explore the sun.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. The reasons the electric universe and the plasma universe have all the facts. I mean, they just shred standard model. If you ask me, it's high time for a paradigm change. We need a revolution in science. What do you think? Thank you to Andrew Dixon, Donald Holden, Andrew Sparkinson, Gregory Heffron, Jack Forbes, Michelle Lemus, Topknot, Diamond Dave from Oppenheimer Ranch Project, Gene Matz, Patrick Dorval, Telly Bipola, Amethyst Crystal, Conrad Rupert, Jared, and Maylee Clark. Thank you. These guys are the most loyal people on YouTube. My gratitude to all of you. To all of you.